This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. And on the gist, we're looking at the essence of India-France relations. We're joined by Ambassador Mohan Kumar. He's been India's former envoy to France and the WTO. He's also the chairman of RIS and the Dean of International Affairs and a professor at the Global General University. Ambassador, good to see you again. I do know it's going to be a busy few days upcoming, but thanks for giving us some time.
Absolutely. A pleasure, Amitabh. Anytime. Thank you. Thank you for having me on your show.
It's our pleasure, Ambassador. Just looking at the recent visits, now we've had a top-level French minister coming here despite the pandemic. The Prime Minister's visit, in all likelihood, is going to be rescheduled to France. He was supposed to go. The EU summit is going to be virtual on the 8th of May. But would you say that France is emerging or has become one of the most reliable strategic partners that India has?
Yes, I think that's a fair conclusion to draw. In the sense that we have other strategic partnerships, including that with the United States, for example, which is much more multifaceted, far-reaching, and so on. But the French strategic partnership has two defining characteristics, in my view. One, it is problem-free, whereas with other countries, you always have issues. With France, we virtually have no issues. The challenge is really to take it to the next level. Secondly, I think there was a gap in our concept of Indo-Pacific when we had relationship with the United States, Japan, Australia. They were all, I think, concentrated on the Pacific. Our concern was Indian Ocean, to be honest, in the context of Indo-Pacific. And there, I think France fills an extremely important gap for India. So I'm particularly happy that three things have happened. One, there is a joint vision statement between President Macron, Prime Minister Modi, 2018. This has been implemented by both sides, and France now has an ambassador exclusively for the Indo-Pacific, Ambassador Penaud. Thirdly, I think France has issued a position paper on Indo-Pacific where it is recognized that 93% of their exclusive economic zone lies in the Indo-Pacific. And most people in India don't appreciate that France actually is both an Indian Ocean power and a Pacific power. They've got Reunion Islands and Mayotte in the Indian Ocean, a lot of real estate. And in the Pacific, they have French Polynesia. And so it is extremely important that we involve France to fill this gap to the west of India, going up to the Gulf. I think that is what has been a success story. And while France is not part officially of the Quad, France has no problem cooperating with India and Australia. I point to the latest exercise that France carried out in the Bay of Bengal called La Pérouse. And Pérouse was a former naval commander of France several hundred years ago. So I think it's really fantastic to see that France, which is a naval power, is cooperating with India to maintain peace and security in the Indian Ocean. So that is something that I would say is a new facet of the relationship between France and India.
Straight away from what you're saying, there's a question from one of our regular viewers and someone who may, in fact, be a closer neighbor to you, but I'm not getting that out right now. Salvador Bonne is ambassador who says, to what extent do you think France's Indo-Pacific is Indo versus Pacific?
I would like to believe that is not the case because there is so much of effort which has been invested by United States on being a Pacific power, especially the Western Pacific and so on. I would like to believe actually that France's interpretation of Indo-Pacific is much closer to India's than with other powers. So to that extent, I don't believe it is Indo versus Pacific. I would like to believe it is Indo-Pacific with a hyphen. And I think there is a lot of convergence between France and India on the Indo-Pacific policy. I also point to the fact that France was one of the earliest countries to post a liaison officer in the Gurugram
Yeah.
Info Center that we have. So at
IFCI or
all,
OAR.
correct. So at all levels, I see France and India converging on the issue of Indo-Pacific.
Converging, ambassador, and in fact the level that India and France are at is nowhere more exemplified than what's happening with our neighbor, with Pakistan and France. Now, would you say that the levels of trust between India and France have also reached a stage because of how the Prime Minister and other top officials stepped up publicly to support Emmanuel Macron when he was attacked a lot by, apart from what is happening domestically, by countries like France, Turkey, Malaysia?
Absolutely. Amitabh, I can give you a personal anecdote. I was retiring as India's ambassador to France on 31st July 2017. So, as often happens to all human beings, including ambassadors, by June, I was focusing more on packing and unpacking, and it was the summer period. Suddenly, in the second week of June, President Macron got elected in France. So I said, okay, now it's time for me to leave. I get a call from the Prime Minister's office in India, and the Indian Prime Minister says, I would like to come to Paris to meet the new president. So in July, would you believe it, I hosted the Indian Prime Minister because he said, there is a new president in France, and I would like to get to know him better. That's the kind of relationship that the two leaders have established. And I'm not at all surprised that we supported the president when he was under attack. And this was in convergence with the principles that India espouses as well. So there is a strong personal rapport between the two leaders, and the relationship in terms of strategic defense, nuclear energy, climate change, and urban sustainability. This is the multifaceted relationship that we now have with France, which is, I think, going from strength to strength.
You mentioned that anecdote, Ambassador, of the president being elected. Well, a related question for the next elections from Ayan Sakar. Do you think the current stance of Emmanuel Macron towards Muslim extremists will hurt his chances of getting re-elected for a next term in office? We're shifting slightly from topic, but go ahead.
Look, I'm going to stick my neck out and say that President Macron will get re-elected. There is always this uncertainty in France when the election cycle begins. There are too many contenders. The far right, led by Marine Le Pen, is showing signs of support. The French elections are always like this. It's confusing. There is a strong anti-incumbency factor in France. The French are fond of saying that France is a difficult country to govern. And presidents who have been there always face a certain degree of anti-incumbency. So I am wagering that when the situation clarifies, and President Macron, if he can get two things right, one, obviously COVID. If he can get the vaccination right, then I think by presidential elections, we will be absolutely fine. The other thing, of course, is the economy. He has to make sure that the common people in France don't suffer. So subject to these two things, I think President Macron has every chance of getting re-elected.
Ambassador, you mentioned the La Pérouse, and now from the 25th, I believe there will be a trilateral with the UAE, and you are mentioning, the Western board of India as well. How important was La Pérouse in the current context, considering that I beg your pardon, the other members were Quad members?
Amitabh, from 2008 onwards, we have seen permanent Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean. So it's relatively recent. It's not as if China has been present in the Indian Ocean from 1990 or 2000 onwards. It's only since 2008 we are seeing semi-permanent to permanent presence. We are seeing underwater drones and submarines. So we are ourselves not in a position to handle this all by ourselves. So we need help. I can think of no better, no friendlier power than France to help us in the Indian Ocean. So I think La Pérouse assumes tremendous importance, because if we can have even a hub and spoke system where the hub is Quad and the spokes are these kind of trilaterals that you have between Australia, France, India, and if we can have a loose coalition of democracies, which includes Japan, Australia, France, India, and so on, I think it would be a fantastic grouping, if you like, which can make a big difference to India's strategic objectives in Indo-Pacific.
In effect, you've asked one of the questions that Dinesh Kumar is asking: what are the chances of France to join the Quad? You're talking about that hub and spoke. But just taking that a little further, when you're talking about the UAE as well, and I'm going to indulge Salvatore Babones again, who asks, how does the Arab world, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, fit into the Franco-Indian relationship?
I will answer Salvatore Babones' question first. I think this Arab world fits into the Franco-Indian relationship because of two reasons. One, definitionally, the Indo-Pacific includes that Gulf region for India. It may not for the United States, but for India it does. For the French, it most certainly does. The French have a base in the Gulf, and that is one of the few places they have an overseas military base. So I really think the French have a very strong presence in the Gulf. This combined with India's strategic interests in the Gulf, which is becoming even more strategic. We just had in the past energy, oil, and expatriate population. Gradually, what we are seeing is a strategic convergence between India, UAE, and India, Saudi Arabia. France, incidentally, has excellent relationships with UAE and Saudi Arabia too. So I see a marriage between Indian and French interests in the Gulf, both definitionally and strategically. As for Dinesh Kumar's question as to the chances of France joining Quad, I wouldn't bet on it. And the reason is France is also doing a tightrope walk on the issue of China. Unlike India, which has maybe $100 billion trade with China and so on, France's interests in China are quite significant. There is considerable Chinese investment in France, and there is considerable exports from France to China, especially of strategic and luxury goods. There is a lot of trade and investment there between France and China. It may not be possible for France to overtly join the Quad and say we are, taking China on. And this is maybe not also in character with France's preference for a multipolar order. So France will continue to be France, and we should not mind that. So we should not insist on France joining the Quad. I am particularly happy that France is participating in the Indo-Pacific experiment or exercise. They are doing Varuna with India. They're doing La Pérouse with Quad plus France. I think that is much more than enough from my perspective. There shouldn't be any interest from our side to force France to join Quad. I think one thing we have to accept is we should be interested in the outcomes, not the process, frankly.
And when you're talking about outcomes again, and you mentioned this, whether it's reunion, Mayotte, we had exercises of reunion. Djibouti, how important are those, especially since India and France have signed that logistics agreement?
France is not just a permanent member of the Security Council, but with the departure of UK, France is the only nuclear power in European Union today. UK has left the European Union, so France is the only strategic nuclear power in the EU. This is something that we should recognize. Secondly, they have a strategic nuclear deterrence, which again is unmatched in Europe. Thirdly, they have vital interests in the Gulf, and they, as you said, they have a base in Djibouti. They also have a base in the Gulf. So I think we need to recognize that France sells a lot of defense equipment to the Gulf countries, to both UAE and Saudi Arabia, as they do to India. So there is, I think, a meeting of minds between France, India, Saudi Arabia, especially UAE, for example. You rightly mentioned UAE, and the UAE has started developing interest in the marine area of Indo-Pacific. So far, they weren't, but they have gradually come to realize that there are significant maritime interests that UAE has got. And that is one thing in which India and France can collaborate and cooperate with UAE. That's, I see that as a matter of great potential between France, India on the one hand, and UAE on the other.
UAE also helped when the Rafales came across. I mean, both when they were landing there or in refueling, etc. So, how important is this trilateral, if I can call it that?
This trilateral is extremely significant because the maritime interests of these trilateral countries, as you call it, are the same, which is we want unimpeded freedom of navigation, we want unimpeded overflight patrols, and we want the choke points to be free, the sea lanes of communication to be free, because these three countries have tremendous trade interests. And as you know, 90% of all international trade is maritime. 90% of all international trade is maritime, and they all have to go through the sea lanes of communication. So, as major trading countries, UAE, France, and India have very similar interests. We need to keep the sea lanes of communication completely impediment free. That is a challenge. Whether you talk of piracy, whether you talk of climate change, whether you talk of the foreign presence which may impede these sea lanes of communication, all of this is a challenge. And that is why I also want to add that France has taken a decision this time when their foreign minister was in India to join the Indo-Ocean Pacific initiative of the Prime Minister. They've joined the initiative. And among the pillars of India's Indian Ocean Pacific initiative, we have given them maritime resources. That is the pillar which France is going to deal with, maritime resources, which is, I think, very appropriate given France's assets and advantages in this area.
And when we talk about the Rafale, Ambassador, France again is one of those countries which is willing to share its technology with us and help with the Atmanirbhar Bharat.
So I must say yes, France is definitely willing to share technology, but I think we are persuading France to participate more and more in Make in India projects, because we want to go from a buyer-seller relationship to French investment in India. We have told them that is the reason why we have bought 32 Rafale, but further Rafale will be dependent on French willingness to invest in India and transfer technology to India. That is something that has to happen so that the relationship can go to the next level, because very frankly, there is no denying the fact that this equipment is expensive. Although it's legitimate, although it's the best aircraft, it is expensive. And we need to keep that in mind in the medium to long term. We have conveyed to the French side that the relationship must evolve to that of an investor so that technology can be transferred to India.
Well, just related to that is a question from VV. How are the chances of an Indo-French defense partnership in joint production of defense hardware and R&D in the near future, Ambassador?
Oh, absolutely bright, I would say. Absolutely bright, because for the simple reason we have told the French that owing to a variety of reasons, of which finance is also an important consideration, we will not be able to sustain the buyer-seller relationship in the medium to long term. So we have told them that the relationship has to be one of investment. The relationship has to be one of make in India. So I would say that the French are absolutely aware of this. And if you go to the kind of research and development and the help we've got from French in the space sector, ISRO's relationship with the French counterpart, which is called CNES, there is evidence that the French are quite open to transferring technology to India. They consider India a reliable partner to whom technology can be transferred. So I would say that going by the experience in space, it is realistic to assume that the French will transfer technology to India.
From space to underwater submarines, Scorpion, how much have we moved there in what you're talking about, evolving from a simple buyer-seller relationship, the Scorpion
So
submarine?
one thing, yes. So one thing about defense is that things do move slowly. I mean, that's something one has to accept. I would say that it moves slowly for two reasons. One, countries want to take their time to decide on defense, because once you decide, then the relationship gets set for 20, 25 years. You cannot keep changing your aircraft, your submarines, your weapons. Well, weapons to some extent you can, but certainly aircrafts and submarines, you cannot change midway. Once you have decided somebody is a supplier, you are pretty much, going to have the same equipment and technology for 20 to 40 years. So countries take time. The second issue is that I think there has been talk, and I'm not being critical. I do believe there is a general feeling among our defense partners that India takes a little bit longer than others. And this is something that I think the government is keen to fix through the defense acquisition procedure, in particular, the principle of offsets. I don't think the principle of offsets has worked greatly, frankly. So it is being relooked by the government. But I think at the end of the day, the government is keen to cut down the time for importing expensive defense equipment. For example, I'm of the view that there should be a sunset clause. You take 2 years over a defense proposal. If you cannot make up your mind, you leave it to the armed forces. Whatever they want, you order. After all, the client has to be happy. You have 2 years to make up your mind. If you can't, then leave it to the Air Force and the armed forces. Whatever they choose, you have to accept. There has got to be something like this. Otherwise, if sometimes we have taken 6 years, 8 years, and even 12 years. The problem with the defense suppliers is they say in 10, 12 years, neither the price remains the same nor the technology. These days, technology changes every 5, 6 years. So by the time you finish your defense acquisition procedure, you might have already been importing older technology. And that's because of the time taken. So I think the government is aware of this. And I think there is a move to cut down the procedure. But I like the idea of a sunset clause. That's the only way it will work. Bureaucrats and others will have to be told, you have 2 years to make up your mind. And 2 years is ample time, you will agree, to make a solid, if you want to make a solid assessment and you want to decide, you decide. Otherwise, it's better you just go by what the armed forces are saying. Otherwise, you are running the risk of not just cost overruns, but also of importing technology which is dated.
Two related questions, Ambassador, from Ashish Kumar. Wait, this is not the one I play out. This one, Ashish Kumar asks, can France replace Russia in military hardware? Do you want that? And Dinesh Kumar, who says, do you think France can fill the blanks somehow created between India and Russia in the long run?
So, you see, I do believe France and Russia's strengths are different. For example, from France, it is the Air Force that has relied very heavily on France right from the beginning, right from independence. We have relied heavily on Air Force and we have relied heavily on submarines, naval equipment. I don't see how we can replace Russia in that sense, because Russia actually supplies quite a bit of hardware for our Indian army. It also supplies other areas, but it is the army which is predominant. Or if you take, for example, the missile defense system that we are acquiring, S-400, which is the best
Yep.
in the business. So I think France and Russia are different in that sense. Where I see France filling a gap, if you like, is the increasing strategic convergence between France and India. You can certainly make that point because with Russia, we do have some differences. Russia, for example, does not subscribe to the concept of Indo-Pacific. So,
Not the board.
and their foreign minister is quite vocal about it. So, that kind of situation, I do agree that there is scope for more rapprochement with France.
The EU also has now Indo-Pacific. There's some movement on that. Somehow related to that, Dinesh Kumar asking, as you know, France is a leading European culture, and many European countries copy their foreign policy of France. So, how does the France and India relationship can it help India's foreign policy with other European nations?
Oh, we have been, that's a good question. We have been relying quite a bit on France, Germany, and UK. These are the three big countries. Of course, UK has now left the EU. So we are left with France, Germany, maybe Italy. So if these are the big European countries. I would say that we have relied on France for a strategic partnership with EU, not for a commercial, economic, and trade relationship. For economics, trade, and investment, we rely more on Germany, not on France. But France, I think we depend much more strategic terms because, as I said, it is now the only UN Permanent Security Council member with a nuclear deterrent. The other area where we have received valuable cooperation from France is in the United Nations.
Yep.
Whenever we have got to blacklist people like Masood Azhar and so on, Masood Azhar, sorry, so
Yep.
on in UN for blacklisting people, terrorism, France has taken the lead on behalf of India because India is not always present in the Security Council. Now we are as a non-permanent member. In the past, we haven't been a member. So France has helped us a lot in the UN Security Council.
I'm just going to take another question from Sinbaga Muthu Rahul, who says, can we have a trilateral India, Israel, and France for defense cooperation?
Yeah, I don't know if you can have a trilateral grouping, but there are similarities. I agree because we do have considerable defense purchases from Israel and from France as well. Some degree of coordination would be useful. I think that's what I can say at this stage.
And I thank all our viewers for those comments and questions. And we're going to take a last one from Mohan Sakti Vail, who says, can the alliance for multilateralism started by France and Germany avert the Kindleberger trap? Or is it just talk shop and a momentary response to Trump, Ambassador?
I wouldn't describe it as a talking shop or a talk shop yet. I think there is a case to be made for multilateralism, but I think that may even get fresh impetus because of the election of Joseph Biden in the United States. Because Biden is now talking so much of this was the case when Donald Trump was in power, and that is why the Franco-German proposal for multilateralism got traction. But I think now it should even be better because with United States now returning to the multilateral fold, I think there is much more scope for cooperation, not just between France, Germany, and India, but also co-opting United States and UK.
Ambassador Mohan Kumar, it's been an absolute pleasure. You've answered so many questions that our viewers have also sent in. Thank you. I do know it's going to be a busy time for you over the next 24 hours. All the best for
Thank you.
what's coming up. Thanks for joining us on StratNews.
Thank you, Amitabh. Good night. Thank you.
It's been our pleasure. And just a reminder that if you like videos like this one, do make your comments on YouTube, do follow us and subscribe as well to our YouTube channel. You can get notifications if you click on that bell icon. Do follow our social media handles as well on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to get the latest news and analysis from an Indian perspective. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.